There's a specific kind of heartbreak that only a maker understands. It's that moment when you've spent 3 weeks casting a river table, you pull the forms off, and instead of looking like a deep glacial pool, it looks like, well, like a Tupperware lid that's been through the dishwasher 1,000 times. It's just this sad, milky fog staring back at you.
A Tupperware lid? That is brutal. But let's be honest, that's where every beginner starts, right? You see those Instagram videos where someone wipes a cloth across a piece of wood and suddenly it's a mirror, and you think, oh, I'll just rub some wax on this haze and we're good to go.
Exactly. You think you can just sweet talk the resin into being clear. But epoxy is a stubborn beast. It doesn't want to be a mirror. It wants to be a hunk of plastic. To get that deep, look into the soul of the wood shine. You have to basically go to war with the surface, one grit at a time. Today, we're talking about the art of the flat and the polish.
And I'm here to make sure Tiger doesn't get too poetic about sandpaper and actually tells us how not to ruin a $500 pour. Because I've seen your shop floor, Tiger. It's covered in the ghosts of failed experimental finishes.
Hey, those are learning opportunities in physical form. But look, the biggest hurdle for most folks, and where I tripped up for years, is the transition from sanding to polishing. People think they're the same thing. They aren't. Sanding is about leveling. Polishing is about hiding the evidence that you ever sanded it in the first place.
Okay, let's start at the very beginning. You've got your slab, the epoxy is cured, and I mean actually cured, not just not sticky cured. Where do you start? Do you just grab the 80 grit and go to town?
If you want to spend the rest of your natural life trying to get those scratches out, sure. But generally, if your pour went well and it's relatively flat, I like to start around 120 or 180. The goal here isn't shine, it's geometry. You're looking for flat. I call it the dead zone because the epoxy looks its absolute worst at this stage. It's gray, it's opaque, and if you have a spouse or a client walking through the shop, they're going to ask why you're ruining the project.
I've been that person. I've looked at your work in progress and thought, well, Tiger finally lost his touch. It's just a giant piece of slate now. But you mentioned something interesting, wet versus dry sanding. I see a lot of debate on this. Where do you stand?
I'm a dry man for the coarse stuff and a wet man for the finish. If you try to wet sand at 120 grit, you're just making a slurry of gray mud that clogs your paper and hides the very high spots you're trying to kill. I use those Mirka Abernet discs, the mesh ones, for the dry stages. They let the dust actually escape. If that dust stays between the pad and the resin, it balls up into these tiny little pigtails.
Pigtails? That sounds cute. I'm guessing in shop talk, it's a nightmare.
It's a disaster. They're these microscopic spirals carved into the resin. You won't see them at 220 grit. You won't even see them at 800. But the second you put that final high gloss polish on, boom. It looks like a drunken toddler took a needle to your table. You have to be obsessive about cleaning.
So, cleaning between grits. That's the pro tip everyone misses?
It's the law. I keep a spray bottle of water or denatured alcohol and a fresh microfiber. If a single grain of 220 grit sand stays on that table when you move to 400, you aren't sanding with 400 anymore. You're just using the 400 to push that 220 grain around like a plow. It's like trying to wash a window with a handful of gravel.
So we've gone 120, 180, 240, 400. At what point does the magic happen? At what grit does it stop looking like a sidewalk and start looking like a window?
For me, the shift happens around 800 to 1000. That's when I switch to wet sanding. Water acts as a lubricant and a coolant. Epoxy is basically hachihix, basically a very hard plastic, and plastic hates heat. If you get that resin too hot with a dry sander at high speeds, it softens, it gets gummy, and once it gums up, you're basically trying to sand a giant piece of chewed bubblegum.
Gross. So, water, low speed, and patience. But let's talk about the jump. I've seen people go from 400 to 3000 grit because they're tired of sanding. Can you actually cheat the system?
No, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you something. It's a ladder, Alex. If you skip a rung, you're going to fall. The scratches from the 400 grit are like canyons. The 800 grit turns those canyons into trenches. The 1500 turns them into scratches. If you jump from 400 to 3000, the 3000 is so fine, it just glides over the bottom of the 400 grit canyons. You'll have a shiny surface, but you'll see the ghosts of the coarse grit underneath it. It looks like a mirror that someone walked across with spiked shoes.
Okay, so we've climbed the ladder. We're at 2000 or 3000 grit. The surface is smooth, maybe a little bit of a satin sheen, but it's still not mirror status. This is where the compounds come in, right? I see those orange and black foam pads in your shop that look like fancy sponges.
Now we're in the home stretch. This is where you get to feel like a wizard. I use a two-stage system usually. A cutting compound first, something like that NW1 white supercut. You use a firmer pad like the orange ones, which has just enough backbone to work that compound into the surface.
And you're using a dual action polisher for this, right? Not just your hands, because my arms are getting tired just listening to this.
Oh, if you try to hand polish a dining table to a mirror shine, you'll have one very shiny table and two very dead arms. A dual action, or DA, polisher is your best friend. It spins and oscillates at the same time, which prevents heat buildup. Remember the bubblegum rule. Heat is the enemy. You want to move the polisher like you're mowing a very tiny, very expensive lawn. Overlapping passes, slow and steady.
I've noticed when you do this, you don't just dump a gallon of polish on the table. You're actually pretty stingy with it.
Less is more. If you use too much, it just splatters all over your shop walls and hides your progress. You want just enough to keep the interface between the pad and the resin lubricated. When that compound starts to disappear or turn clear, you stop, wipe it down, check your work. If you still see haze, you go again.
And the final step? The ultra gloss? I see you switching to that soft, wavy black pad. It looks like something you'd sleep on.
That's the glamour shot phase. That black pad is super soft. You use a fine finishing compound, something like Top Finish 2. This isn't cutting anything away anymore, it's just burnishing the surface. It's like the difference between a clean car and a showroom car. When you hit it with that final pass, the wood grain suddenly develops this three-dimensional depth. It's like you could reach your hand 6 inches into the wood.
I have to ask, because I know people are thinking it. What about the wood? You're sanding this epoxy to 3000 grit and using wet compounds. Doesn't the wood just soak up that moisture and freak out?
That is the million-dollar question. And it's why I don't usually wet sand the wood itself. You have to be surgical. I'll tape off the wood edges if I'm worried, but honestly, by the time you're at 1000 grit, the wood is usually already sealed with a bit of resin or a base coat. But you're right. If you let a slurry of gray epoxy mud soak into the pores of a piece of white oak, you've just turned a beautiful table into a gray mess. You have to wipe and wipe and wipe again.
So, give it to me straight. How many times have you finished a table, stood back, and realized you missed a scratch back at 400 grit?
More times than I'd like to admit to someone with a microphone. There was this one Buckeye Burl desk. I thought I was a hero. I got it to the final polish, pulled the lights over, and realized there was a pigtail right in the center of a clear section. It looked like a tiny curly hair frozen in ice.
And? Did you leave it? Call it character?
I wish. I had to take the whole top back down to 400 grit and start the entire ladder over. It was a 6-hour mistake. That's why I tell people, check your work with a raking light. Put a flashlight right against the surface at a low angle. It'll reveal every sin you tried to hide.
A raking light. Sounds like a tool for a detective, or someone who's just really looking to be disappointed in their own work.
It's both. But look, the payoff is worth it. When you get it right, epoxy doesn't look like plastic anymore. It looks like liquid. And that contrast between the rugged, organic grain of the wood and that perfect, man-made void of the resin, that's the whole game.
So the big takeaway for the folks at home, don't skip the grits, keep it clean like a surgery suite, and watch your heat.
And don't be afraid of the dead zone. It has to look worse before it can look better. If you're at 400 grit and you feel like you've ruined it, you're actually right on track. Just keep climbing the ladder.
Spoken like a man who has spent way too many hours staring at his own reflection in a piece of resin.
It's a vanity project, Alex, quite literally.
Thanks for the deep dive, Tiger. Next time, I want to talk about how you managed to glue your shop vac to the floor, but we'll save that for the disaster series.
Hey, that vac has never been more stable. See you next time in the den.